Dear Professor Steinbach, dear Dr. May, dear Petra Pinsler, dear Tim, dear friends and colleagues. Now, Tim, you might have realized that everybody was excited when you have addressed this nice audience in German, and I thought I could do the same. But then I recalled a nice experience when I was a PhD student. I have to give a lecture in Frankfurt, and obviously I did this with a very strong Bavarian accent. And after my lecture, one of the big famous professors came to me and said, as a foreigner, your German is really excellent. So I would like to avoid such a situation today, and therefore I will continue in English. Now, what I intend to do is, in order to find the common ground with you, but also to sharpen our disagreement, I try to answer three questions. My first question will be, is economic growth feasible? And this is a quite important question due to the fact we have to take into account ecological limits. Now, the second one is economic growth desirable? And this is, from my point of view, a philosophical question. And it will show that economic is indeed also applied moral philosophy. And then in my third part, I would like to explore and to argue why we need indeed a new economic paradigm. And I believe that the paradigm of the social and the natural commons is an appropriate one, and then I will conclude. Now, my first argument when I try to answer the question, is economic growth really feasible? I intend to put the whole growth story of modernity in a perspective, in a historical perspective. And one of the reasons why we had economic growth in the past was there was competition, there was enforced private property rights, and a second important ingredient was that humankind had a lottery prize at the very beginning of industrialization. The pre-industrial societies depend heavily on the inflowing sunlight. They were trapped in a poverty trap, so to say, and food, fodder, heating, mechanical energy were drawn from biomass, water cycles, and wind power. This was basically a flow economy. So after humankind detected coal, oil, and gas, they have been able to rely on stocks with a high energy density. And this was the reason why population, GDP per capita, has been increased fundamentally. And this was, so to say, one of the most important reasons why humankind was able to achieve human well-being and also to escape the poverty trap. But this comes with a price. The emissions has been increased also. And what we can observe here over time, we can observe this also when we analyze cross-country surveys. It's an almost one-to-one relationship. The growth of assets per capita, of capital stock per capita, increases the emissions by 1%. This is the same what you can see here over time. And it seems to me that it has been burned in the memory of humankind that overcoming poverty and achieving human well-being is associated with using coal, oil, and gas. And this is a quite fundamental issue, in particular when it comes to the international climate negotiations. The increasing emissions led to an increasing of global mean temperature, and it turns out over a while that it's not the scarcity of the fossil fuels, even in the 21st century, which is the most important problem. It's the scarcity of our things: the atmosphere, the oceans, and the forests. We have used and we will use the atmosphere as a disposal space, which leads to dangerous climate change. The acidification of the ocean might accelerate climate change and disturbs the marine ecosystems fundamentally. So there are some concerns, in particular brought forward by our colleagues from natural science, that we are already at some of our planetary boundary conditions. And I have no intention to deny that there are some planetary boundary conditions, in particular when we take into account oceans, forests, and the atmosphere. But what I intend to show is, first of all, what happened over the last 30 years. And this is a figure which hopefully explains why many people believe that economic growth is a fundamental problem. So these are the growth rate of the CO2 emissions per year, and the triangles show the growth rate here. And then we have here decomposed the growth rate of CO2 emissions in two components. So the first component is GDP per capita. Then this is population. These bars are the emission, the energy intensity, which means a declining energy intensity is increasing energy efficiency. We have learned over time to use our primary energy much more efficient. And here we have the carbon intensity, which means this is the carbon content of 1 unit primary energy. So and it is quite obvious over time that you can see that the most important contributor to the increase of emissions is indeed economic growth. It's not population growth, it's economic growth. And unfortunately, the increasing growth rates of emissions is accelerated by an even increasing carbon intensity, which is caused by the renaissance of coal, because coal becomes, over the last few years, incredibly competitive, in particular in the power sector. But the most important observation here is, and the most important message is, it's economic growth which has contributed the largest amount to the increase of CO2 emissions. And therefore, it might be justified to ask the questions, do we really need economic growth? And can we afford economic growth? And then the question is, can green growth rescue us from this problem? Can we keep up economic growth and still to protect the environment? And there are basically, from my point of view, two fundamental concepts for economic growth. One is from the OECD countries, which basically says we have to ensure the natural assets in order to continue with economic growth, but to keep the natural assets, so to say, in a balance with the other assets. I will come back to that later. But the UNEP has defined, so to say, a new story of economic growth, which is fundamentally a story telling us that investing in our natural assets, in environmental protection, can solve most of our problems. It enables us to eliminate most of the trade-offs. This is a co-benefit story. If we try to pursue economic growth, we can at the same time increase the employment, we can at the same time to increase human well-being. And this is what UNEP tell us. They have compared two business as usual scenarios, and you can see here, this is the forests, and this is the ecological footprint compared to 1970 to 2050, and this is the environmental footprint, the biocapacity. So which means basically the biocapacity is one. We use one planet Earth to fuel, so to say, our economic growth. And it is quite clear that in both business as usual scenarios, we will increase, according to the UNEP, we will increase the emissions We will increase the usage of forests, the fishing grounds, and croplands in an unsustainable way. And then they come to the conclusion that what we can do is we can have a green growth scenario which enables us to reduce emissions, to reduce our ecological footprints, and to have at the same time economic growth. They promised us having our cake and eating it too is really a feasible story. But from my point of view, and I agree here with Tim, this is a quite flawed macroeconomic concept. Because UNEP assumes that all other investments will remain at the same level, and at the top of these investment strategies and on the top of these investment levels, we will then invest, for example, in climate protection, in forest protection, and this will allow us also an increasing economic growth path. This leads me to the other message. Green growth is not sharply defined, and the concept lacks empirical verification. So maybe degrowth promises a more straightforward solution to reduce emissions. And many people, including Petra Pinsler, argues that degrowth could be a good idea. I will talk in the second part of my presentation that we might and we should discuss to what extent a materialistic lifestyle is appropriate for us. But first of all, I would broaden our perspective to the whole globe. And the first observation is that economic growth over the last 2 decades has enabled us to reduce poverty substantially. Here you have the growth rate, and here you have the poverty reduction, which means the income growth in the class of the poorest people. And we have to be aware that we have people who are living in absolute poverty, and without economic growth, in particular in Africa, their chances to escape poverty is quite low. Now, we did a very rough calculation for the sake of argument and for the sake of simplicity. Here you have the GDP per capita in current US dollars. This is the income level per capita in the US, $49,000. $10,000 in Latin America, $1,400 in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now let's assume for a while we can agree, just for the sake of argument and simplicity, that we have no longer growth. From my point of view, the only morally justifiable way to distribute income and economic wealth across the planet is an equal income distribution, which means, so we can increase the income per capita in Sub-Saharan Africa to then $10,000. For the Latin America countries, they can remain at the same level, but then we have to reduce in the US basically a degrowth path about 80%. From my point of view, at least these pathway would create a lot of social conflicts, and I do not believe that this is really a feasible pathway. Socially, a feasible pathway when economic policy should take into account in a proper way the social stability of our societies. Now, I think I did a little bit an injustice to the people who are arguing that there's a problem with economic growth, and therefore I take the argument quite seriously to what extent economic growth is feasible when we are confronted with the challenge and the scarcities of the atmosphere, the oceans, and the forests. And therefore we have compared 2 growth pathways, a high growth pathway and a low growth pathway. And I fully agree with Tim when he argues that a high growth pathway and a low growth pathway requires a reduction in carbon intensity in an historically unprecedented way. Now let's compare this. This is the high growth story. And these are the growth rates, and the growth rates decline over time. And here we have a little bit a decline in energy intensity, which means that we can assume that the improvement of energy efficiency will continue for a while. But, and this is quite true, then we have to achieve a reduction in carbon intensity in an unprecedented way when we have a high growth pathway. But now it comes to the interesting thing. When we compare the high growth pathway with a low growth pathway, you have much lower economic growth, much lower population growth, but at the same time, you need a lot of reduction in carbon intensity, which is also a reduction in carbon intensity which is unprecedented from the point of view of our historical experience we had over the last 5 decades. So this is the technological requirements we need to achieve a 2-degree target, for example. This is the business as usual scenario in a high growth pathway on emissions. These are the emissions in a low growth pathway. And it's clear that the pathway in the low growth case for economic growth and emissions is lower. And this is the pathway, what we have to achieve, the emissions pathway, which we have to achieve when we intend to achieve around the 2-degree target. And here's a gap between what will happen and what should happen. And there is a way to fill this gap with energy efficiency, with a lot of renewables, with biomass and carbon capture and storage. I'm not arguing here that all these technological options are without risks. There are fundamental risks. But if you compare this with a low economic growth path, you have basically all the same components in our technology portfolio. And therefore, from my point of view, the low growth pathway is a little bit too unspecific. Limiting global warming to 2 degrees requires a reduction of carbon intensity about 4 to 7%. And the degrowth might reduce the needed annual reduction maybe by 2%. But where should the other roughly 2 to 5% come from? And they must come from technological innovation. And they must come from a very well-designed, reasonably designed portfolio of mitigation options. So you can map this portfolio of mitigation options in a 2-dimensional space, so to say. Here you have the risks. Nobody will deny that nuclear power is without risks. And here you have the opportunity costs of foregoing mitigation options, which means what's the increase of mitigation costs when you try to phase out, for example, nuclear power, or when you try to phase out investments in carbon capture and storage. I do not intend in my lecture here to promote a very specific portfolio of mitigation options, and I fully acknowledge that if we might enable a low growth scenario, we can reduce the risks of nuclear power. We can reduce the risk of biomass because we have to rely to a lesser extent to these technologies. But the degrowth strategy would reduce this risk at best indirectly. And here we have to distinguish the ends that a policy should achieve from its means. Which means we need very specific policy instruments, for example, carbon pricing, in order to make renewables competitive in the portfolio of mitigation options. We need technology policies like R&D subsidies. We need insurance schemes in the case of nuclear power, land use management, and so on. And here I would like to compare the situation with a simple metaphor. Let's assume you are driving with a car in a landscape with a lot of hindrances. So then the degrowth and the growth debate, it seems to me, argue it's sufficient to have a brake and to have an accelerated pedal. But it seems to me we need also a steering wheel to handle all the hindrances in this complicated landscape. And the steering wheel are carbon pricing, technology policies, insurance scheme, land use management, very, very specific policy instruments. And from my point of view, if all environmental goals can be reached with these goals and technology risk addressed by an appropriate policy instrument package, why deliberately slow down economic growth? I do not see any reason for this. However, I have argued now that continued economic growth is probably feasible for the next 5 decades. And if we see some externalities and risk, we have to implement specific policy instruments. But now it comes to my second point. Is economic growth really desirable? And this is, from my point of view, a philosophical question, an ethical question. And it's absolutely legitimate if societies ask themselves, is it desirable for us to pursue economic growth? And probably you know that there is this famous Easterlin paradox, where people argue that we have a remarkable decoupling of real per capita income from the happiness index. And I know that this Easterlin paradox is heavily contested. It suffers from data, from measurement problems. It does not take into account increases of life expectancy and might not be valid in cross-country studies. It would be very worthwhile to discuss all these empirical studies, but nevertheless and fundamentally, this is not an empirical question, it's a philosophical question, it's a question about our lifestyle and about what we want to achieve. And in any case, this example shows that growth cannot constitute a goal in itself, but it might help to attain things that increase well-being. And we have some information what might increase well-being. For example, family relationships, a financial situation which is appropriate, work, community, friends, health, personal freedom, and so on. And 80% of the differences in life satisfaction can be explained by divorce rates, unemployment rate, trust in other people, membership in voluntary organizations, the quality of government, and even the belief in God. And additionally, there are key factors of happiness, in particular in mature countries. For rich countries, inequality might be more important than the absolute per capita income. We have to take into account this, that inequality matters for our level of happiness. And it might be a helpful information, in particular for governments who try to manipulate reports on inequality and poverty, that people will feel also unhappy when inequality increases, but also become very angry, realizing that such reports are manipulated. Enhanced growth might not be desirable per se, but there is no reason to restrict economic growth, and we need to think about how we define social welfare, how we define human well-being in the first place instead. Now, I tried to explain that there is more in life, there is more important of the meaning of life to pursue what Tim called materialistic goals. Now, the question I would like to ask you now is, what our measures, what our accounting system on GDP? So there's a nice saying in business schools saying, what's not measured, it's not managed. And therefore, it seems to me it is worthwhile to think in an appropriate way, what is the precise meaning of GDP? There's a lot of GDP bashing. But now my question is, can we improve our GDP measures? First of all, the monetary GDP is the monetary value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country as border over years in time, and it's basically for a closed economy, consumption and investment. So the crucial question is what is the real meaning of this GDP? Now, it comes to the complicated part of my talk. First of all, when economists try to evaluate policies, economic policy, most of the time they use social welfare functions. And in particular, the non-economists might believe that the social welfare function is one of the most craziest ideas economists ever invented. Now, I tried to convince you that the social welfare function is not necessarily a nice thing, but it's a reasonable tool. It's a handy tool, because we need some criteria to evaluate our economic policies from a normative point of view. And I would like to recall us that economics has also a very important component, which is applied moral philosophy. So, and there is no reason why we should exclude happiness from our social welfare functions. And there is no need why we should not relate health, personal freedom, community, and friends to happiness. And also we could ask, to what extent is the level of GDP related to achieve these goals? This is what a social welfare function is doing. Unfortunately, in most of our social welfare functions, there is only one component, which is consumption, material consumption. And if material consumption is the only component in our social welfare function, it's totally okay to say the current consumption investment is what GDP should measure. Under this very specific assumption, GDP means human and social well-being. However, nobody believes that consumption should be the only component in our social welfare function, so we should include other components which are quite important. Now, for the next 3 minutes, I ask my non-economist colleagues for a little bit patience. So, all my friends ask me to delete all the next slides. I resisted, because I found these slides so wonderful. Because all of these slides include a very marvelous formalism, which is called in economics the Hamiltonians. And I am sure that we are quite late, but everybody is excited about Hamiltonians, and therefore I intend to present them. So, first of all, if we have here only consumption, our social welfare function, it turns out that we have here NNP, which is national net product, consists of consumption and investment. But this NNP, and this is quite important, even for non-economists, the NNP measures the maximum level of consumption that can be sustained forever. And this is a kind of a criteria for intergenerational justice. So what we have to do is, we have to ask ourselves, period by period, do we consume too much on the costs of the future generations? Do we running down our assets? This is the only reason why we need such an accounting system. So you might argue, but consumption shouldn't be the only component in our social welfare function. I would say, yes, I agree with you. Let's include other components, for example, here G. This might be museums, parks, expenditures for health and education. And then we can include this component in our accounting system. The next question might be, what about strong sustainability? What about strong sustainability when we impose a carbon budget on our world economy? So how will this change our accounting system? And the answer is, yes, this will change our accounting system fundamentally, because then we have to include the depletion of resources, and then we have to include the use of our atmosphere in our current accounting system. And this is doable and it's possible. And I agree with you, it's very hard to come up with appropriate prices and with appropriate accounting prices. But again, approximately right is much better than exactly wrong. And therefore, we should include these components in our accounting systems. So, and this is an exercise the World Bank has done. So they asked the question, so this is our investments, and then we have to take into account the depreciation of our physical capital, take into account our investments in education expenditure. And I will come to that in a minute, where we show that most of the creation of wealth over the last 10 years, was due to the fact we had a remarkable accumulation of human capital. And then we have to take into account the depletion of natural resources and also the pollution damages. So, and this is a very nice measure of NMP, which asks the central question of sustainable growth. So what can be consumed in one period without undermining the ability to produce the same NNP in the future? Or in very simple terms, how much can we consume when we do not intend to running down our assets? And here are a few examples. Here you have the genuine investments, and you can see in sub-Saharan Africa over the last years we have seen a remarkable running down of assets. And here we have China. China has remarkable net assets, so to say, but they are at risk to lose the assets, running down the assets when we take into account climate change. Now I come to my last point, and then I would like to conclude. From my point of view, we have to think in a new way about the wealth of nations. And when we talk about the wealth of nations, we have to take into account the wealth of our commons. The wealth of nations consists of privately produced capital, human capital, social capital, and natural common capital. And the crucial question from my point of view is, so can we develop a diagnostic tool, so to say, which allows us to identify areas of underinvestment and overinvestment? So, and this will be now my last formula, I promise, but it's again a very marvelous one. And this is simply, and this is a very powerful tool, in particular for our politicians. Now, what does this say? It says that basically the social return on investments of all our capital stocks should be equalized over time. The social capital, the private capital, natural capital, and human capital. And I would like to give you a few numbers. 80% of the new wealth created between 1995 to 2005 consists of intangibles, of human capital, followed by produced capital, and land assets around 11%. And this is a powerful tool. I would like to give you just one example. You might ask the question, is the increase of land values, a housing bubble, net wealth for a society or a net wealth destruction in a society? And you can come up with a very careful analysis showing you that when land rents increase fundamentally due to a housing bubble, this disincentivizes the investments in physical capital, in social capital, and in other natural capital. In the end, it's not a net wealth creation, it's a net wealth destruction. So this is just a tool which should help us to find a way to identify areas of over and of under investment. So where are areas of underinvestment? In the United States, for railroads and for the maintenance projects, new urban construction projects is about 88% social return on investment. I was not able to find out what the social return on investment for airports in Berlin is, but I believe this is not interested at all for people here. So the other thing is the atmosphere is a global common. What I just said is that there's a limiting disposal space of the atmosphere, and we have a lot of resources underground, and we are at risk to overuse the atmosphere. So in that sense, the social return on investment in mitigation technologies is quite high when we try to take into account the scarcity of this limiting disposal space. Now, do we have any reason to believe that the social return on investments are the same as the private return on investments? Or we could ask the question much more fundamentally, are markets really able to invest, to incentivize all these investments in an appropriate way? The markets are not able to do this because there are a lot of intertemporal spillovers in all these components, and therefore what we need is a reasonable policy schemes which helps us to overcome this underinvestment. An appropriate choice of common property regimes in the case of the atmosphere, subsidies, taxes, public investments, and so on. And the definition, the political definition of the common properties allows us also an interesting way to create new income from taxation, which might help us also to invest in public and in social infrastructure. And in this way, we can overcome the inherent trade-off between efficiency and equity. The central question for economic policy is not growth or degrowth, but welfare, for which common property regimes and public policies are a very fundamental aspect. So let me conclude. Continued economic growth seems feasible, at least from the perspective of climate change mitigation, provided that the externalities are properly addressed. Economic growth cannot be a goal in itself, but it could help to attain desirable objects. Public policy should not primarily be concerned with growth, but with economic welfare. And this is the kind of public debate which we need. And different members of society do not have necessarily to agree on a definition of welfare, but they have to agree on how to manage common pool resources and common property regimes. The central question for economic policy is not growth, green growth, or degrowth, but whether there is an over or underinvestment in common pool resources. To conclude, the wealth of nations in the future will rely mainly on the wealth of commons. Managing the wealth of commons will be a challenging task. However, I believe it's a worthwhile task, or to conclude with the German phrase, this is a task, die der Schweiß der Edlen wert ist. Herzlichen Dank.